What's up, people? We are glad that you are here.
Is that really the start?
Yeah, why not?
Oh, you just jumped right in. I didn't know you were actually starting.
Oh, yeah.
Hey.
Oh, we are in it. It is live. The people can hear us.
We are here.
Yeah, so let's do this thing. We got a conversation that I'm intrigued to see how it goes.
Me too.
Most of the time we do have some kind of outline just so that we can keep our coherent thoughts as a triune group right here.
We are the second Trinity.
Oh no.
No. That's not. Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
I'd have to be like that too. That actually works really well. I'm the oldest. You're the most prophetic. Like
We are going to get in trouble.
Brennan's the most like
We need to
Jesus.
start over.
No.
Keep it.
No.
Cut him and clip it.
The people need to know how this actually goes. Anyways, I was saying sometimes we do have an outline, but right now we just have kind of a blank slate where we'll jump into this conversation. But before we get there, let me hear you guys' favorite worship person/group right now.
Mine is Mav City for sure. This is Brennen Lake's probably my favorite individual person. I know he's kind of all over the groups, but Mav City is just all around good.
Yeah.
Great quality music, great lyrics, good stuff.
That's great.
I mean, I will always probably say Shane and Shane, and
Oh.
not even
Expected
because it's
that.
my favorite now.
Yeah.
It's not the what I listen to most now. I think just from when I first became a Christian to stuff they put out with the worship initiative.
consistency.
Yeah, it's just great.
Yeah, they are great. I would say right now Elevation. I
Yeah.
mean, their last couple
They
of
are
albums,
crushing it.
they're so good.
So good.
And you
Who's
always you always know when an album's good when it's got no skippers.
Yeah, that's true.
That's fair.
Yes.
That's like Victory album. That's of Bethel.
Oh,
Fucking-
yes. So
yeah.
good. And like, I get it. You can hit a one-off every once in a while, and there's a good song on an album, and that makes it a good artist. But when you can get like
Yeah.
a consistent
Bangers.
15 songs, and I will listen
is
to every single
ridiculous.
one, and they have different voice and like tone, and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, that is so good. Their newest album is Lion. If you haven't heard it, you should go listen to it. Now, I want to ask a separate question. What is your sleeper? What is your sleeper worship pick? That if someone was going to ask you, like, and you want to go under the radar with this one, who do you pick?
My first thought, and I don't know how under the radar it is because they're growing, but is Influence Music.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. That's a good sleeper pick.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
not like blowing the charts off, but they've got some really good stuff.
Yeah, mine would be, it's Blue Jay House Worship.
Okay.
I don't have anything on my actual phone, but I find them on YouTube almost every week because they're dropping stuff like crazy,
Blue
and
Jay
they are
House.
so good. Blue Jay House Worship.
All right.
Ben?
Probably Justin Bieber.
He
He's led
did-
worship a couple of times. He did.
There's a song
Jaena
named
once.
Holy, right?
Oh, we want to get into that?
No.
Oh no, we don't. I don't know under the radar. I like Jason Upton, but he's actually probably more famous than people realize. But not
Yeah, I
a lot of
don't
people
know.
know who he is.
I don't know who
I
that is.
probably would know
so-
if I heard something, but
Yeah.
I don't know the name.
Yep.
I feel like a good one. You put me on to John Mark Pantana. That's not
He's
really
great.
worship,
Oh, yeah.
No,
but
he's
he is
good.
so good.
Yep, super
Yeah.
good.
Super
Yeah.
good.
Okay, let's
Yep.
move into the conversation now. The reason we asked you about, and I hope maybe you answered.
Cheers.
Yeah, what's your guys'?
your
Let us know.
favorite?
Yeah,
Read in the
let us
comments.
know in the
Do the
comments.
Dora. Do the Dora. What's your favorite? Stare at
The
the
awkward
camera.
wait.
Yeah.
But we started talking about this because a lot of us at the table, I would say probably all of us, and Dylan included, we like stop it. I see you staring at the camera. Ben is being a weirdo.
I worked out really hard today and I don't feel great. So my
We
mind
all
isn't
like
here.
we all like
Anyway.
Hillsong worship.
Yes.
Yeah.
They have created so many
insane.
amazing songs, great albums. Just they've been an anthem for some people in their Christian walk. And now we are stepping into a time where Hillsong is really controversial.
Yeah.
That if you didn't know, welcome to the conversation where we're about to talk about it. But that's okay. Ben hasn't seen it either, and he's going to be our voice of reason, helping to process through some of these things. But Hillsong is in this controversial moment where there was a documentary that just was released about a month ago already, and it's a 3-part documentary on Discovery Plus. And it overviews the history of Hillsong up until this point, as well as the controversies that have kind of plagued them as a ministry over the last 2-3 years. One of the biggest ones that started it really was their New York pastor. Hillsong is a church that exists in 30 countries around the
Yeah,
world.
it's
They have
crazy.
hundreds of campuses. And one of their biggest ones was the one in New York. It was led by Carl Lentz, and he had this affair that came to the light and kind of destroyed their New York location, and they still haven't recovered from that, and it started to shine a light on them, and then they went from that place to a couple other controversies, and now Brian Houston, who's their global pastor, one of the founding members who Hillsong is actually based out of Australia, if you didn't know that. And he was there, and now he has a ton of controversy surrounding him. He ended up stepping down from his position or being fired, whatever language that you want to read. And now there's this documentary that is exposing, that's what the title is called, Hillsong, a megachurch exposed, that's exposing some of this. And so we wanted, as people of spiritual influence over those that are listening, we wanted to be able to speak into this because it's a problem that we see across Christian history, honestly. It's not new, yet it feels really close to home for a lot of people as they've listened to the songs. Maybe they've read books by these authors. They've watched the sermons. They know who Hillsong is, and now there's this huge gap where it's like, what do we do with all this information? How are we supposed to feel, and what are we supposed to think? And in that, we just want to speak into that a little bit, that we don't want to tell you how to feel, we don't want to tell you how to think, but we want to inform you based on what we would feel is correct and right in these things. Sound good?
Yeah.
Is that a good intro? We're good?
Yeah. So.
We will talk later in the podcast if we would advise you to watch it or not, but we're going to give you a bunch of information before you get there. So let's just start with some initial thoughts. That when it comes to the documentary, Hillsong, the intro, all the things, what would we start this conversation with?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
As you said.
That's fair. That's good, though. I wanted Ben here, having not seen it, because then he can check some of the things Jaena and I will say.
Or just ask questions.
Or
try to if they come up. If not,
but if we start talking because we've both seen it and you get confused, then someone who's listening will probably get confused.
Yeah,
so
that's good. Yeah. Yeah, when I watched it was, I don't know, really disheartening. Hard to watch because of that gap of having, there was a time where Hillsong songs were the only songs the church did for a while because they were the only ones really producing anything. But I think it was really challenging for me to watch and to even process through some of the things. And so I hope that this conversation gets to lead other people in doing the same thing.
Yeah. I think some of my initial thoughts, I always come to I like to look a little bit behind the product before I consume it. You know if that makes sense? It's like I watch the documentary, but what's behind the documentary? Who produced this? Why'd they produce it? And when you look into some of that, they are a secular institution, a group, a set of directors who put this on. And secular just means non-religious, and so they don't have Christian affiliation. That's why it came out on Discovery Plus and not Christianity Today. And because of that, there is a tint that kind of covers the whole the 3 hours that comes from a cultural perspective, which for me, one of the reasons I find that's important to start this conversation is it plays into a lot of the things they say, that they have an agenda, they have a bias, just like every single one of us do.
Yeah.
You can't set that aside as you step into a moment like this. They are producing this with a purpose in mind to expose Hillsong, but also in some ways as a secular organization to expose the church, the global church, the message of Christianity. So, I would just start with a little bit of that there.
Even just knowing where it's from.
Yeah, knowing where it's from is really important.
Like this. Yeah. And knowing where it's from and what other things have they put out.
Yeah.
Just gives and again, I haven't watched it, but gives me an understanding of, okay, I think I can maybe assume, which, as we assume, at least, why would they put this out? Why? There's always a why behind everything. For
sure, absolutely.
In the world, right? So it's like, okay. But also at the same time, because they're a secular source, they probably have more resources than a Christian organization would to actually expose some things or call out some things. But it's just good to know, what the source is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I just think, like you're saying, it's probably good that there's a check coming from the outside. If all your checks come internally, then...
Or usually they don't happen internally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point, too.
Rarely do you see churches call out churches. And if they do, it's so negative and unhealthy that it actually ends up destroying the church more than if a secular source would do it.
Yeah, let's do this. Let's go. Or we're already in it. Like I told you, there's really no outline. The one that I think of is The American Gospel, which is the documentary on Netflix. I have really mixed emotions on that because that one is Christians producing a documentary talking about other Christians, and they do so in a way that I find is they hold a lot of truth, but they do it in a way that's not loving or kind to those who are a part of those organizations or those who they're even going against. And I'm not saying that we need to put on kid gloves to deal with issues. You know, like we can speak an honest, real truth, but Jesus always comes full of grace and truth. Like there's this say the reason for the hope that you have, but do so with gentleness and respect. There's this duality that it means to be Christian and to expose that which is hardship. And you can argue Jesus called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs and he flipped the tables, but those are minute pieces of Jesus's overall candor in which he deals with the weight of the world, you know?
Yeah.
Let's jump into another small conversation that the title is Hillsong, a mega church exposed. And there is absolutely intentionality in choosing the title and using the word mega church. That there is this buzzword. What would we at the table right here? How do you define a mega church? Ben's Googling.
Yeah.
But
it used to be 1,000 people or more.
Yeah, and they just
now it's
changed
2,000.
it. Yeah.
So if you have a church that would regularly, not just would call the church home, but regularly has an attendance of Sunday morning of 2,000 or more, that is technically a mega church.
Okay.
Technically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we,
yes,
as a church,
pre-COVID, and
but
almost
even
right now, very close,
right on the bubble of being a mega church.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is weird to think
really
about.
weird.
Yeah.
It is.
Doesn't feel like it, but
when people watch that, they see the title and even some of what's come up in the last 10, 15 years around mega churches, because really mega
Do you
church...
know what the dictionary definition is?
Oh, gosh, yeah. Let's
a church with an unusually large congregation, typically one preaching a conservative or evangelical form of Christianity. Interesting.
okay.
Yeah, I could see that.
Because you probably wouldn't call the Catholic Church a megachurch.
Although they have some of the biggest congregations in
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because they're also not a denomination.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But how do we take that definition, the title that they've given us, and what do we think of mega churches, right? Like there's clearly a slant here where they paint a mega church in a bad light. And I think that's one of the things the documentary will lead you to start to believe, that this mega church model can't work. It doesn't happen. There's too much power at the top, whatever the explanation is. What would we say to that before we start going into some...
I think even the question I have about the documentary, again, because I haven't seen, is do you feel like it's strictly against or towards mega churches or just church in general?
Oof. Both and?
Yeah, maybe.
It's clearly not in favor of the mega church as you watch through the documentary. But like I've said with the secular tone, there's a tint where almost all of what they talk about, they leave this vagueness where it's like, yeah, we're talking about Hillsong, but are we talking about something bigger than that? Like it's never explicitly said, but they want to lead you into that question. And that's okay. It's okay for us to wrestle with that question. That's what we want to do with this podcast today. But when it comes to mega churches, I think they paint a very clear light.
Mega churches are as bad as house churches and as good.
Okay.
It's not what we want to do so much, I think, just in life and maybe in the Christian world, is we want to attack and evaluate how things are done and not ever look at or know how to even ask the questions of the why.
Yeah.
And so of the motive behind. And so it's at your mega church with a specific motive, if it leans unhealthy and negative, is as bad as the house church that has just as an unhealthy motive. And a house church being a smaller church that meets in a home.
Yeah.
And so the hard part about the whole idea of mega church, or even what we see in scandals, is we only ever hear about the scandals in the mega churches and the bigger churches with the big celebrity pastors. What we don't hear is all the scandals and unhealth in smaller churches, because it happens too. And then with that, we also don't hear the positive things that are happening in mega churches. Because you're not going to. Like when things are really good and healthy, and vice versa, same thing with smaller churches.
Yeah. And that transitions really well into just this final initial thought that we'll flesh out, is like, even though Hillsong has had immense problems that we'll chat about, God has done an incredible work through the ministry there. Like there are people who have been faithful there. There are people who are deeply in love and passionate about Jesus there, that people have come to faith, been discipled and grown in their relationship with Jesus through a flawed institution. And so we have to recognize some of that. Like, and the documentary doesn't necessarily do that. They don't.
And won't. That's not their goal.
That's not their goal. But like, if you look at the Mars Hill podcast, which Ben and I have talked about a little bit, that comes from a Christian source, and they do what I think is a really good job of balancing. Yes, this was an awful situation with bad leadership and terrible outcomes. Yet in the midst of that, God was working something beyond what we could even imagine, that he was still moving in the midst of a really dark, broken place.
Because all of churches are broken institutions. All of local churches are a broken institution because they're run by broken people. And so all Christians are discipled by broken institutions. And so that's part of the process of being the church is to continually to grow even in the midst of that.
I feel like there's a question there. Like, how do you sign up to be involved in a, we are, we're a flawed organization, a flawed church, because we have flawed people running it, yet we represent a flawless God. Yeah. That is our role, really, to stand in the middle and to be the priests, the shepherds, the pastors, the leaders, of a God who is perfect as imperfect people. Like, how do you encourage people to still be a part of what God's doing here when there will be wounding and hardship?
Yeah. Because the call isn't to perfection, the call is to reconciliation. I think of the 2 Corinthians 5, like just the beauty that the message of reconciliation that Christ brought, that he is now given to the people of God, to followers of Jesus, to us who, whether leadership or not. Now we are bringing that message of reconciliation to the world as Christ's ambassadors. So like, that's all, yes, we're flawed people who continue to need help healing and discipleship, going to a world of brokenness and flawness and unhealth. But what we're bringing is a message and a beauty of, despite that, even in 2 Corinthians 5, it literally says, Christ is no longer counts our sins against us. Like, that's what we're bringing. And that's beautiful to me. It's, again, the call isn't to perfection, but to transformation and reconciliation.
Yeah, and if someone were to ask me somewhere like that, like, how would I sign up to be, and I think people do ask that question, like, why would you be a part of the church? Like, look at all the things the church has messed up. Look at all the people who get messed up. Like, why would you sign up for that? And for me, it becomes, when you look at what the reward is, the eternal destination of heaven, and us believing Jesus is the way and the truth of life, the only way to get there, like, the reward makes it worth the hardship that you might endure going through it.
Well, that, and it's like, we're 3 people here who are broken yet are redeemed.
Yeah.
And are continuing to pursue redemption. I'm going to start crying. I have 3 kids at home who won't experience what I experienced growing up. Because of Jesus.
Yeah.
That's huge. And that's what, and that again doesn't make life easy, right? And we know that. It's but life has been better with Jesus, and there's still been some crap and hardship. But it's just, that's what Christ can bring. So eternal life, and there's eternal reward, but life starts now too.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Let's dive into a couple of the more specific things that the documentary addresses. So we have 6 written down here. I don't know if we'll cover all 6, just depending on time. We don't need this to be an hour-long podcast. But the first one that becomes really glaring as you watch the documentary is what appears to be the financial, mishandling within the Hillsong context. For example, they have a guy who comes on who speaks about his profession is to look into nonprofits and different things, and he sees the Hillsong as an organization has registered as an LLC, which is a for-profit organization. That's how they do their taxes. That's how they are affiliated as corporately, which is really odd because churches typically are nonprofit organizations. Like, if you were to check our tax status and who we are as Grace Point, you're not going to find us as an LLC. You're going to find us as a nonprofit tax. That's what I'm trying to say. I got lost in my own language, but in that, there's also the whole picture they paint of rich, famous pastors, which we could do a whole podcast on rich, famous pastors. There's the sneakers and the preachers and sneakers. There's the fancy cars, luxurious trips, all that. Where would we speak into some of this? I know you haven't seen it, but you've wrestled with this yourself, this just idea. How do we speak into, as a couple of pastors who sit around the table, what we see in the documentary, but also just what we see in the church when it comes to the financial mishap?
I would like to have you guys go first, more so because you've seen it. Go from that end, and then I can either ask questions for clarity or go through what I just how do you know if the church is out to make money?
For sure.
Ooh, how do you know if the church is out to make money? That's what we're starting with?
No. You start with the documentary.
Okay.
Wrestling with this whole idea of the financial mishandling.
Oh, goodness. I don't know where to start. Where would you start?
Oh, when it comes to it's hard. When it comes to their evidence that Hillsong is registered as not as a nonprofit, they register as a corporation. That to me is a huge red flag. How you would find that out as a local congregant I think you just have to ask.
You ask. Yeah.
I would hope they'd be transparent with you. I don't know if they would, but like you just have to ask, like, hey, how are we registered as an organization? Yeah. Because if your church is registered as a for-profit organization, that's a red flag to me. It's not what we're meant to be doing.
Yeah.
There's a lot more flexibility with LLCs than nonprofits, which makes it then more dangerous. Like with a nonprofit, you need a board of directors.
Yeah.
You need to have specifics to where everything is going. With an LLC, you don't. And you're not personally held accountable for what happens with the money.
Yeah.
Which just sounds dangerous from a church world perspective as I think about like the difference between an LLC and a nonprofit.
Maybe go for this, Jaena. Like, what do you feel and think when you see preachers in sneakers?
Yeah.
When you see luxurious preachers rocking, I mean, in the documentary, I think they talk about Carl Lentz wore a $20,000 hoodie.
Yeah.
What is that? What does that mean for the church that we look at that?
There's a part of me that like that rubs the wrong way fairly significantly of like, you have that much money that you can afford to have that. But like, how much better would that money be used, if it was given to someone in need, or, something like that, to even like address like the wealth gap in our country. But then like, I also think about the reality of like most pastors' salaries are paid by what the church makes. Like ours it's based on like how like tithe and things like that. And so when you get a church that's as big as Hillsong, the money that comes in is greater. So then the pastor's salary goes up. It's like, it's just a proportionate thing.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't know. I wrestle with it because it's like, I also believe very strongly that people should be paid fairly for the service they provide. And we could talk about what fairly means in a whole different podcast.
Yeah.
And like there's reality that maybe some of the things that they have like were given to them as gifts, like and like brand partnerships and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. I feel uneasy, but I don't have like clear thoughts that I can formulate to take an opinion on.
And I think that's okay. The reason I'm cool with that is like, you've wrestled with it, you've thought about it, and you're still coming to conclusions. And it isn't clear cut. I honestly don't believe it's like black and white. This is what a pastor should make. This is how they should spend it. Like
what you should make is absolutely not black and white.
Yeah.
How you should spend it, I think there are biblical principles.
Yeah.
There are. But my issue and hard part is I've never had a conversation with someone who spent a ton of money on clothing and cars. Like I haven't been able to sit down and ask why. Like why do you feel like you need this? Because if it's to keep up with an image, I would wrestle with that personally.
Yeah.
I would wrestle with that. Why do you have to keep up with a specific image? I would just wrestle with that. And then that's where hopefully if I'm in that, like I want to have a conversation.
Yeah.
I struggle with like, man, if you are spending a ton of money on materialistic things, I struggle with it.
Yeah.
Based off what we need versus what we have.
And here's where I've kind of figured it out. In the doc, they talk about how there was misuse of company cards to buy personal items. Totally off. Yeah, not
any
good.
business organization that is immoral,
that
and
is
unethical.
fraud.
Yes.
Yeah. So like that is not the conversation we're having. Is like if they used company cards to buy $2,000 J's, like that's wrong. But like Jaena was saying, there's oftentimes like a percentage of a church's income of money. So whether that's tithe dollars, offering, whatever that is given proportionately to the staff. So if, hey, a church is set to spend 30% of its income on staffing, then no matter how you have staffing, then that's divided up. So if a church brings in $1 million, what's 30% of that? But if a church brings in $30 million, that's a huge chunk. But you have to, then the percentages might still stay the same. Maybe the lead pastor gets 10% of that. Now that lead pastor making 10% off of $30 million, that's a huge chunk of money. And when it goes into their bank account and it's their personal dollars, for me, it becomes, again, it's personal conviction. I think where you talk let's have conversations. Why do you buy $2,000 J's? But then it's up to them. If we're just being faithful to tithe and to give to the local church, which I feel like is what God has called us to do, we need to trust, or we need to at least, be okay with them having that personal conviction. And if they have convictions that are different from you, have those conversations and those questions. But
I think you raised an interesting point too when we talked about this after we both originally watched it. of like in their particular situation, like for Carl Lentz to spend that much money on something is to also recognize the context that he's in, you know, and so he, by wearing something insanely expensive, now has influence with celebrities. That's like, that's weird when you could talk about that, but like, does he lose influence or input in those spheres of influence where he could do God's kingdom work if he doesn't even have his foot in the door in that simple way? And like, that's where it's like, again, like, and it's not black and white. It's like, it's just interesting.
I'm drawn back to, I had this pastor, and I can't remember who it was, but they were telling this story of one of the first times they preached a sermon. Someone came up to him after and they said, your fingers and your fingernails are so gross, I couldn't pay attention. And so he started getting regular pedicures or manicures. Which one's fingers? Manicures. He started getting regular manicures because he didn't want people in the congregation distracted or like not being able to listen because of his fingernails. Where it's like, that's a silly example. But really, if you stand up on stage with a Gucci sweater in the context of New York City where they value money and materials like that, does that draw people in for them to hear the gospel message? But I get that it's like, what you catch them to, like what you catch them with, like you're going to use and I get there's like a nuance in that, but the context and the culture in which he was in also matters in some ways.
Yeah. Well,
John
even
Tyson
to make it in our
context and culture, and he's not pursuing that stuff.
But even to think about,
I'm just saying, like, there's other pastors. Tim Keller is in the same thing and doing incredible work with Redeemer Presbyterian.
But their church contexts are very different.
Yeah.
So like that, you know, so the people there.
Who do you want relationship with?
Yes,
and which is I think is a good question.
And then if you ask the question, if everybody is Tim Keller, if everybody's John Tyson, who's reaching the people that Carl Lentz is reaching?
Both, not just it's not just the down and out; it's also the up and out.
Yeah. So it needs to be both. And do you catch the rich and the pompous with fancy clothes? I don't.
Could you do it without it? That's a good
I would hope so.
I don't know.
You know, but
you can only answer that question in that context.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's where the gray comes in. Yeah. Let's jump to another topic. Yeah. There is the next huge thing that comes up.
How do you know if a church is seeking to make money?
Oh, you want to ask that? Okay.
I think so.
Ask.
Yeah.
100%.
That's the answer to 90% of your problems.
If there's
have the conversation.
And if there's an automatic they won't disclose, immediate red flag.
Yeah.
Immediate red flag.
Right now, here at Grace Point, we are putting on a local church conference.
In 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks. It was called our Anoint Conference. And you can come and we will show you
where every dollar goes.
Yes. And that should happen in every church context. All the time. And
I know churches who pull it out every week. And they put on a bulletin. They don't have to, but like they just here's where money's going.
Yeah. Well, that's so smart. Like right now in our context at SDSU, we're having this problem that there's the entire School of the Design where the students are now asking the question, where does our finances go? And nobody's able to tell them. It's like, what?
Yeah.
What is happening to the money? Like the church needs to answer that question. So ask that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's jump on to the next one. Great catch. Good answer to that question.
Goes back.
There is the conversation of the sexual misconduct that was happening at a part of Hillsong. And the documentary paints it as it's a culture that from the top down was perpetuated. And so therefore, it's not just one individual that made a mistake and did something wrong. It was an entire...
It's the system.
It's the system that allows that individual or individuals like that individual to exist and continue in positions of authority and power. So why don't we... how do I want to attack this?
So obviously it's not... we affirm there's no forms of, there's no lines of clear accountability and communication to keep. Is that what you're saying? Like to stop it?
Yeah. So like just to explain that there is, Carl Lentz's had his affair, and that came out, which obviously like he's spoken up about and like the church has said is not okay. But what was the system that he was a part of that allowed him to go about that for that period of time? Or there's other examples where they show where staff members were accused of things where it got covered up, it got set aside, it got like honestly like some victim shaming, some things that were like making sure that other people wouldn't come forward, or if they did, it wouldn't go to the right people so that something actually changed, where it was an organizational like honestly cover up that their culture was rotten.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. So what would we say in that? Like what's the conversation of keeping individuals in positions of authority accountable? What's the conversation about like hypocrisy in the church where the people who stand on the platform and preach purity are behind the scenes not living pure lives? Like, where does that all come in?
Well, I mean, just in general, again, not speaking with knowing anything about really what's happening at Hillsong, I know a few things. If there's a situation in a church where the buck stops at the lead pastor and there's no like board of elders there who have hired them, to me, it's like I would be uncomfortable being a senior pastor in that position where there's no one on top of me, where there's a clear line of accountability, where the people underneath me could go and say, hey, we have an issue with this. Or if there's not a board in the church where we can have an issue with this, where I don't oversee or lead or am a part of. Like, so if there's not a clear line of accountability, that to me needs to like be addressed. But also it's as simple as, what are the constant like modes of checking in, and how are you like being held accountable with your time, talent, and treasures? Like the biggest thing for me, even the whole Ravi Zacharias situation, was literally like, you just had to do like look at his checkbook. And some red flags would have shot up. Okay, you do that also with your time. What are you doing with your time? And then you have relationships that you've had established both inside the church and outside the church, where people can ask you challenging and hard questions. And that's not what's happening, because there's a lot of freedom and there's no one to hold them accountable because they haven't pursued those relationships, or those boundaries haven't been set.
So what do you say to the person who is in the local church and is trying to figure out if their pastor has that? Like, how do they go about finding that out?
Ask.
It's the same.
Really?
I think it's the same thing.
It's okay to ask,
or even like
ask how the politics of your church work. What boards do you have? Like, how does your staff break down work?
Run?
You know, like that. And that doesn't have to be like a confrontational question. That can be simply, hey, I want to know how our church works. And then, like, far too many people don't realize that there are boards that they can be on in their church to have say and influence, and even just to know behind the scenes things. So if it's something that you really care about and are passionate about, and we probably all should be to some extent, like, how do you get involved in that process?
No, that's good. And in this topic, the one of like sexual misconduct, there is no gray area.
Biblically, no.
Like, when it comes to the financial one, there's things we could talk about here at the table that says, I could see how they could get there. I could see how they, like, when it comes to this, like, what happened was wrong. Like, the victims who were not able to have the freedom to speak up, that didn't find justice, like, that is wrong. And that is something we will never, like, condone or be okay with. And it is our job to make sure that that doesn't happen in our context and in others as we continue to speak about this. Where it comes is, I just want to ask this question: how do we deal with like that hypocrisy in the church? Like, I feel like this is the tip of an iceberg that is bigger. You know, like there's the sexual conversation where the pastor preaches on purity and then doesn't live the pure life. But like, what happens to the pastor who preaches on pride then is prideful? What happens to the pastor who is preaching on generosity but doesn't tithe themselves? Like, where is this like accountability and hypocrisy? How do you deal with that in the local church?
It's a loaded question, because it's different in every church.
Okay.
And so I think more so it's like, how do you start with your own hypocrisy? Like, what are the avenues that you have to check yourself in that? And if there's not freedom, if you don't feel comfortable or freedom to go and literally ask the leadership of your church these questions, that's a problem. Like, that to me is an issue. Like, if you feel like, and then it's, how do you stay in that? And like, what are the avenues of serving in that?
And not because you just feel uncomfortable, but because you know you'll be gaslit.
There's fearful. Yeah, correct. Like, there's fear, like, of actually, like, I don't know what's going to happen to me if I do this. And so how do you deal with it? There's hypocrisy in every church. So not just giving into it and have a fatalistic attitude of like, well, we can't do anything with it. It's, how do I personally pursue Jesus, and are there people within the context of the congregation and church who can have those accountability questions?
I think even like when something of a scandal comes out, because that happens in the local church all the time too, in smaller settings than just Hillsong. How do you address the injustice, seek like healing? I almost use the word retribution. I don't know if that's the word that I want.
Like reconciliation.
Reconciliation, thank you, for the victim. And then how do you help the perpetrator? Because you can't, like, we've done a whole podcast on cancel culture, right? Like, we don't want to swing that direction and just be like, okay, well, you're done, you're out, because that's still a person who God loves, who needs reconciliation as well. So how do you take the steps to seek the help for that person, even if it's not you personally, like, but you, like, how, like, are you checking in? Are you aware of the systems and processes of how things are working?
I hate to cut this off, but we got to keep moving. There's two more that I for sure want to address. The first one becomes the music. And this one doesn't have to be quite as long. Jaena's like, oh, come on. But the documentary talks about Hillsong worship. So there is a huge part of Hillsong that is not attached to Sunday mornings. Like, it's the music they produce, the tours they go on, the places that they go, the artists they produce. Like, Hillsong worship can exist without the church. Yeah. And so in that, what do we do with their music now? Because the documentary paints them as part of the problem, that they created music that was emotionally manipulating of the people who were a part of it. So they wanted people to come into their Sunday mornings and cry, because if they got people to cry, then they'd be more receptive to give money. Like, what validity is that? Like, is there validity in that? Is there not? Like, what do we do with Hillsong worship now?
First, I like to, all of music, secular, religious, all of it is emotional manipulation. That's what music is. It causes you to feel, and it causes you to have emotions. So, and it can be abused for sure. Yeah. But that's what all music is. If you come on a Sunday morning, if you come to an Oasis, part of my job is to create an emotional environment for you to walk through for the night. Realistically. And I've wrestled with that because I don't like the idea of emotional manipulation, because I think that's can get into emotional abuse there. But that's part of what it is. That's how it works. That's what music does. And so when it comes to Hillsong, I think what you can wrestle with is okay, even in that process, if you think you are being emotionally manipulated, or just in general as a worshiper, do you take the time to be reflective over the songs that you sing, over the songs that are done at your church? Do you really look at the lyrics? Do they actually say something? Because sometimes they don't say anything. Yeah. Is there theology behind it? Is there purpose behind the words that we're singing? Do they actually lead us into worship, or are they just causing us to feel something and cry? Whenever someone tells me, oh, I just loved worship, I cried, I always like to ask, well, why? What were you feeling? What were you experiencing? Because crying isn't bad. Yeah. That's an expression of an emotion, but what's the emotion? What's going on behind it? Why are you feeling that way? And don't be afraid to, in your local context, meet and talk with your worship leader or pastor or director or whatever it is, to ask those questions. Yeah. Because it's another thing, we need checked just as much on our theology as the preaching pastor does, because there's so many songs out there, and asking why you pick the songs you do, what's important about these lyrics, and if they can't communicate that with you, for me, that's a red flag. But
what do you feel like, what do you feel like is the line? If you could give an example that becomes emotional manipulation.
Oof.
I think manipulation inherently is not negative. I think there's manipulation to coercion, which is getting people to do things they don't want to. Yeah. And then there's manipulation and persuasion and helping people move to a place where it's influence. You're influencing to a point of and like you said, I would phrase just the idea of music is just emotional in general, because it's artistic.
It just that's what it is.
Which is beautiful. It's how literally how it was created. Yeah. And so I think the negative side is am I coercing someone to do something they don't want to do? And I don't know what a specific example of that would be. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's more of a circumstance. You can only define that in the context again, because I think there are contexts of worship through music styles that, if that's not what you are part of, seems emotionally manipulative. I've known, this maybe gets into a whole different thing. I've known white people who have visited Black church and said, oh, it's just emotionally manipulative music. They play all the big riffs and they do all the crazy, going off just because they're trying to get you to feel something. That's not true. That's just a part of the culture of their church that, for them, isn't emotionally manipulative, because that's normative. Yeah. Or you could say the white charismatic movement, not to take just that it's a race thing out of it. Yeah. There have been groups that it's oh, they're just trying to get you to feel something or cry. It's that's part of their culture. That's part of their context. And so it's hard to draw a hard, fast line on it. I think, Ben, you described it really well when the emotion or what you're being led into is something that you don't feel comfortable with. So it's the altar call that nobody raises their hand. He said, oh, I'm just going to wait a little bit longer. We're going to play a bigger riff so more people raise their hand, more people come up. That's a little bit of a manipulation. If it, it's forcing people to step into a moment that's gets awkward, Yeah. So, I don't know. It's harder.
No, yeah, it's definitely. So now I'm going to ask the big question. What do we do with Hillsong worship?
It's a great question.
Because what's the issue in the documentary with why they would say don't?
They don't say don't.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't necessarily say don't, but they lead you in that way, that they would like you to not support anything Hillsong.
Because by listening it, you're automatically supporting it in which ways?
Well, like so like this is a conversation, again, where it becomes by supporting a music organization that's attached to a church, that the financial incentive you give to the church comes through the music organization. So if I play Hillsong, if I buy Hillsong's album, if we play Hillsong in our church, then people would look up that song, then they'll start listening to Hillsong. So now, just by singing the music that they produce, we've financially contributed to them, as well as we've contributed to their quote-unquote brand. We've helped give them platform, we've given them influence, then people might go listen to their sermons, they might go be a part of their church, like that it's this whole, like, what does it mean to endorse someone is kind of what it is.
I think that, like, when you look at the background of how the music industry works, it doesn't come down to one person. So even if I go listen to a Brooke Ligertwood song, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people behind that one song that have made it happen. That if you looked through all of those people, you'd probably find things that aren't good, whether that's managers, editors, producers, like
labels,
like all of it. And so it gets hard because we're still wrestling with that of, do we continue to play Hillsong stuff, or like how? Because Brooke Ligertwood is part of Hillsong, but she's also independent. So it's like, how do you find that balance, And do you throw out the baby with the bathwater? Do you cancel the whole thing? Or do you continue to use what is still good, what God is still using? And I don't know.
Yeah. What do you think?
I feel like we're just saying a lot of I don't know.
Keep listening to it.
Keep listening to it?
That's what I would say. I think it's, at what point can you really evaluate the amount of influence you have or don't have towards another organization or person? So it's like, would you stop listening to secular music because you technically are supporting them? It has nothing to do with Jesus. Yeah. And so it's like, well, that doesn't count because it's not toward organization. Well, it's still toward the person who's going to create more music. That has nothing to do with Jesus. It's like, I wouldn't say you have to automatically stop listening to that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe this is where personal conviction comes in. That if you feel very strongly that you shouldn't listen to them because you support that organization, that's fine. That's a fine stance for you to take. But you can't always hold your convictions over everyone else.
And here's where I'm at. I'm in between. I'm still undecided. Hillsong literally released a new album like a week ago. And I have it added, and I haven't really listened to it. And the reason for that is, like, I'm okay. Part of the conversation I've heard is, like, we're all flawed people. And so everything we do is flawed. So the people who produce the music for Hillsong, yes, they're flawed. But if God didn't use flawed people, nothing would come about. How could I preach a sermon if I was like, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, there's this idea that we'll just wipe it off, we'll just continue to support because we're all flawed people, which I feel like is just so shortcoming the whole conversation. You're just throwing a typical Christian answer out there. It's like, yep, we're all flawed, so we'll just support it. Where I'm wrestling is it's not just a conversation about individuals at this point. It's a conversation about an organization. It's a conversation about a bigger structure that is supported in ways by the music. So I want to support Brooke Ligertwood. I want to support the Christians who are making the music who want to glorify and praise God. I do not want to support the organization right now. And so I'm trying to figure out, how do I do that? How do I listen to the music and support the artist without supporting the organization with my streams? And there's no clean-cut answer with that. Yeah. Like, they are still making music that glorifies the Father. Right. They're still making music that will absolutely be anthems for Christians as they walk through life. Yeah. But there is this culture that we need to wrestle with and see. Yeah. Quickly, because we're getting long, I want to do one last topic, and then we'll kind of wrap up. But the last part of the documentary I want to talk about is they have a bunch of volunteers that are interviewed throughout the documentary. And their volunteers are like their core witnesses to testify to the culture, to the character of the leaders, to the just experience. And they paint the volunteer culture of Hillsong as terrible, that they are abused with their time and their resources, that their talent is manipulated in the wrong way, that they are made to show up at all hours, at all times, to make sure that the business of Hillsong continues. So the question I want to ask here, and I'll just make it pretty clear, is how do you make sure that the volunteer culture at your church is healthy? Like, let's just keep it there. Like, if what these people are saying is true, which I don't know if it is, I wasn't there, I wasn't a part of it, but I'm going to believe them for the most part right now. I'm going to give them the respect to believe what their experience is, that there was an unhealthy culture there. Now, if we look here at Grace Point or whatever culture you're part of, like, we have a ton of volunteers. Our church does not run without volunteers. Yeah. How do you make sure that's a healthy volunteer culture?
I think you do what we say, only actually challenge it and check it of, do we actually want more for than from? And then how do we know we're doing that?
Yeah. Would you add anything on that as you lead a big team of volunteers?
Yeah. I think that when the team of volunteers is so disconnected from its leader, that can be a red flag. You know, so is the leader that's over you, like, do you have a relationship with them? Maybe you're not best friends, but do they check in? Do you have conversations with them? Do you get to see them? Do they offer support and have an open door to be a resource to you? And if you can't, if that doesn't exist, then that leader's probably not stewarding that team as well as they could.
Yeah. I love that. You both said it, hit right on the nail on the head.
Nail on the net.
But like, as you volunteer, there's supposed to be in the gospel commission of what it means to be the church, this giving and this receiving in volunteerism. Yep. That as you give of yourself, there is this receiving that Jesus tells us that life is found not in receiving, but in giving. That Jesus came to serve, not to be served. And so there is this beauty that we are actually asking you to volunteer for your benefit. That the volunteering and giving back to the local church is supposed to be something that helps you become more like Christ. Now, if it's not doing that, and if you are just filling man hours, if you're just doing a task, then that you've lost that. Yeah. We constantly tell our people as they volunteer, you are not just holding a door. You are not just making coffee. You are pastoring and shepherding. That the things you're doing in these moments connect you to the people who are around you that you serve with, and they also provide space and opportunity for others to come and to be a part of what God wants to do in this morning. So all of that becomes this volunteer culture that is for the kingdom, not for the church. Like, Grace Point doesn't need to be the biggest church in the world. It doesn't need to exist in 10 years. If we do, praise God. By his grace alone, we will. But we need to continue to build the kingdom, and we want our volunteers to represent that.
Yeesh.
Last question. Ben, are you going to watch the doc now or no?
Eventually, for sure.
Yeah?
Yeah, definitely.
So why? Why would you watch it?
Because I don't have a predisposition or a background of being hurt by the local church. And if I did and haven't received healing in that, I would say don't watch it yet.
Yeah.
And so that's one. I think I just want to, as a pastor in general, and as one who is actually very pro megachurch, because I'm pro all forms of church. I want to see it because I want to know what really is happening. Yeah. And just to hear, because it's also conversations we're having around our staff. So it's like, I know there are people having these conversations who have seen it around me. We can have good, cordial conversation where we may disagree, but that actually creates health within our culture and staff culture. Because like, for us to be able to disagree on things is actually really good, like to have those conversations, because we're so for each other. So for me, I will watch it to gain information, to see really what their perspective is, and even knowing, like, going into it that way of like, okay, this is whoever put it out is their perspective on what happened. They interviewed real life people who were associated with this. So it was like, they did their work. So I'm not going to come in with some like negative, they're just trying to destroy the church. I'm saying, like, here's what's happening. That probably still won't affect or change if I listen to Hillsong music. Because if I would listen to it now, why would one documentary change if I'm going to listen to it later? And I'll see what happens. If I believe that my listening to a Hillsong song is supporting the system of oppression that is happening and injustice that's happening in it, then I'll change my answer to that. But yeah, I think I definitely would throw out hesitation for those who, if you have a history of being hurt by a church, any type of local church, and haven't pursued any type of healing for it, haven't gotten counseling for it, haven't like talked to a local pastor who is in a good, maybe healthy situation, I would just throw caution. Just because all this could do is either bring up continual damage that is within your soul, or it could continue to give you a negative connotation of what all churches are like, when that's not the case.
Yeah. I would say, yes, watch it with caution.
Yeah.
From the very start, we've told you this comes from a source that has its own bias and its own agenda, as well as throughout the documentary, I am not a fan of how they prove all their claims. But that's just a a logistical communication research thing, that just because someone says something does not mean it's true.
Yep.
So there are things that they say that are probably inaccurate, that are not true. And when they don't have sufficient evidence for some things, make sure that you continue to challenge that idea.
And even with that, like you said, they interviewed volunteers. For every for every interview they did with a volunteer who had a negative experience, there's probably just one who had a positive experience, which might be real, that you'll never hear.
And this was part of my problem, and we're on it, and we're already way long. Why not we just keep, like, there are hundreds of Hillsong churches around the world, and they have 2 staff members who are on the documentary from Ukraine. And Jaena and I talked that, they might have their staff members on NDAs. I don't know what the exact situation is, why they wouldn't be able to. But if the documentary was going about conducting obviously huge amounts of research, they found 6 to 10 core volunteers to interview, but 2 staff members out of, there are probably thousands of staff members who have been a part of this church, a part of this. And there's probably hundreds of those thousands who have been hurt and have found this similar experience. But why were they not interviewed? Like, the staff should be the people who are most in tune with the character of the leaders, as well as most in tune with the culture and the vision mission of the church, not necessarily the volunteers. But good?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. We're going to wrap up there. Thank you for sticking with us for this long journey, this haul. If you have further questions, I think you heard 12,000 times in this podcast that you should ask, that we are approachable. One of the podcast topics I wrote down is how to approach a pastor. I would love to have that conversation. But we are approachable people who are just trying to follow Jesus, that we're asking these questions because we want to learn. And we would love to join you in having a dialogue on this topic or any other. But thanks for tuning in. We will catch you next time.
Bye.
See you soon.